got Dr. Tim Soutphommasane, who's going to talk about Leading for Change, a blueprint for cultural diversity and inclusive leadership. Now, Tim's the Race Discrimination Commissioner and has been since 2013, so this is going to be a really interesting perspective. Considering where we've been in the last couple of days, this is another dynamic and another dimension altogether. So could you please welcome Dr. Tim Soutphommasane.
Oh, thanks very much. Great to be with you. I think I'm the only one in the Australian Human Rights Commission who would have studied agriculture at school. For those of you from New South Wales, I went to one of the ag schools in Sydney. You might be thinking James Roos. No, it's the other one, Helston Agricultural. So it's great to be able to have some contact from time to time with agriculture, however modest the contact may be. And today I want to talk to you about cultural diversity in leadership. And I haven't had the chance to be with you yesterday, but I did have the chance to sit in on some of the previous sessions today, and it's been really interesting to hear the conversations about data, about innovation, and about how you can get a competitive advantage in your work. And my view would be that there's enormous potential for you to use cultural diversity to your advantage. We do very well in Australia as a multicultural society, but we perhaps don't get the most out of our multicultural society. What I mean by that is that we're extremely comfortable with food and festivals when it comes to cultural diversity. We're not as good in valuing diversity of thought or practice, and that's revealed, in my view, in how we conduct leadership today. So what I'm going to talk you through is some of the research that we've done in the last 12 months on this issue. It's involved a partnership between the Commission, Westpac, PwC, Telstra, the University of Sydney Business School, and we gave ourselves two challenges. One was to provide a snapshot of what Australian leadership looks like in business, in politics, in government, and in civil society. Most of us had an intuitive sense of what the numbers would look like when you broke down senior leadership according to cultural background, but to date, there has not been a comprehensive set of numbers to verify this intuition. This is the first time we've put together numbers for senior leadership across these sectors. The second thing we wanted to do was to give some guidance on how organisations can embrace cultural diversity and get the most out of what is a national asset for us, our multiculturalism. And the proposition here is a very simple one. If you don't deal with cultural diversity in the right way, you may not be getting the most out of your talent in your organisation. And that's going to affect your productivity, your decision making, and ultimately your ability to adapt to what is a very fast changing global economic environment. But first things first, what does our cultural diversity actually look like? If I were to ask you what proportion of our population were born overseas, what would you say? Any takers? 10%, 40%? 25, okay, who said 25? You're very close to the mark. 28% of the population was born overseas, but those of you who are thinking 40%, you're not far off either, because close to 50% of the population was either born overseas or has a parent who was born overseas. That's been the general benchmark for looking at cultural diversity, but for obvious reasons, that's a very imperfect benchmark, because you could be born, for example, in the UK, or you could be born, for example, in New Zealand, but if you're using just your place of birth to be a proxy for cultural diversity, you may not be actually capturing what you're seeking to measure, which is why we've done this. We've used some different classifications, a different taxonomy to understand what cultural diversity looks like. This is based on the Diversity Council of Australia's research, and what we've done is we've aggregated cultural backgrounds into 4 groups: Indigenous cultural backgrounds, Anglo-Celtic cultural backgrounds, European cultural backgrounds, and non-European cultural backgrounds. The suggestion here isn't that you can only fall into one of those 4 categories, or that you have to tick boxes, but this gives us better guidance on what our cultural composition actually looks like. And there you'll find that about 68% of the population have an Anglo-Celtic, which is to say British or Irish, cultural background. We estimate that about 18% have European but non-Anglo-Celtic, so Italian, Greek, French, Polish, German. About 11% have non-European cultural backgrounds, Asian, African, Middle Eastern, Pacific Islander, South American, and 3% have Indigenous backgrounds. Now, how do you think our leadership fares if we were to replicate this exercise? Let's look at the ASX 200. We looked at the ASX 200 CEOs, and there you'll find that about 3/4 have an Anglo-Celtic background. The European component seems to be roughly proportionate to the general population, but note there the underrepresentation of non-European backgrounds and Indigenous backgrounds. Just 5% non-European, 0 for Indigenous. If we look at our federal parliament, we find a similar pattern, at least in the Anglo-Celtic composition. European composition, again, is very close to what we estimate is 18%. But again, note the low non-European composition and the Indigenous composition there. If we were to break that down further and look at our ministry at the federal level, so this is our cabinet ministers, our ministers, assistant ministers, 81% Anglo-Celtic. There's one who has an Indigenous background, Ken Wyatt, but no one has a non-European background in the federal ministry. The numbers actually get worse when you go to look at government. So 83% of our federal and state government departmental secretaries or equivalents, so your directors general or chief executives of government departments at the state level, have an Anglo-Celtic background, 15% European, but look at the minuscule representation there of non-European and Indigenous backgrounds. To give you a sense of what this actually means in absolute terms, this is a cohort of 124. 0.8% means 1. So there is one government departmental head who has a non-European background and one who has an Indigenous background. We've used universities as a proxy for civil society. Of the 40 university vice-chancellors, close to 83% have an Anglo-Celtic background. There's one Vice-Chancellor, the newly appointed Vice-Chancellor at Canberra University, who has an Indian cultural background. He's the only one who has non-European background. The remainder have European, primarily Northern European backgrounds. So that's what the numbers tell us. And we had to do a bit of work to collect this data because unlike gender diversity, there are no reporting requirements for cultural diversity. So whereas Australian companies beyond a certain size have to report to the Workplace Gender Equality Agency every year, there is no equivalent requirement on culture. So we've had to go through publicly available information, look at factors like people's surnames, what they've said on the public record, where they were born, using techniques that have been used by scholars in America, in Canada, and elsewhere to be able to collect this data. Now, I would say that there's an issue here that's worth exploring. If we are comfortable about our cultural diversity, then you would hope that diversity would be represented in greater numbers at those senior levels of leadership. This isn't a problem that we find in our universities. If you look at our top graduates coming out of our universities, or if you look at our top performing high school students, there's simply no problem with cultural diversity there. If anything, cultural diversity is overrepresented in that cohort. Now, if that's the case, and if we are a society that believes in appointing people based on merit and according to their ability, then there's a blockage here somewhere. And the cause of that blockage, the nature of that blockage and how you remove it forms the second part of our blueprint work. But before I get into the diagnosis and what we propose as steps to remedy this, I want to make the case in hard terms for why cultural diversity should be embraced. And here are the numbers to back up the case. McKinsey, a number of years ago, did a study of 366 companies in Europe, in South America, and North America. What they did was they broke down these companies according to their gender diversity and according to their ethnic diversity. And they found that the top quartile of companies, when it came to gender diversity, had a 15% greater likelihood of outperforming the national median. The national mean. Should say mean there. The national mean when it came to profitability. That would support the arguments that many of you would have heard before in the gender equality context about why it makes sense to get gender equality right. Now, they also found, though, that the top quartile of companies based on ethnic or racial diversity were 35% more likely to outperform the national mean on profitability. So in other words, if there's a payoff from getting gender diversity right, the payoff from getting cultural diversity right might be even greater. Now that's based on 366 companies as the sample. I think it's compelling evidence. But analytically, the reasons for this are fairly straightforward. If you are a homogenous organisation, if you have people around the table who come from the same backgrounds, have the same assumptions, have the same styles, then you may have blind spots. You may not be able to bring to bear the kind of problem solving that you need in a modern context. And that, I think, is the core of the proposition here. Apart from the fact as well that if you're going to do things in the right way from a moral perspective, there's also an obvious reason why you should include cultural diversity as part of your treatment of diversity. Let me go through the steps that we've prescribed for organisations to get cultural diversity right. But just before I do, I want to say a little about what I would what I believe are the barriers to more cultural diversity coming through the ranks into senior leadership. And they concern our defaults for leadership. We still have in Australia certain assumptions about what leadership should look and sound like. And this is borne out in the research and in the evidence that we have on leadership and management. For example, if you are above average in height, you will have a greater likelihood of being a CEO or a manager, which obviously is bad news for me when I finish up my term in 2 years' time. I take cold my wife, however, comforts me. She says, that's okay. There are other factors in your favour, because they also say that people who are better than average on physical appearance make for good leaders too. My wife is very good at lifting me up and cheering me up when I feel down about my below average height. But you think, if I were to ask you to close your eyes, don't actually do this, but if I were to ask you to imagine in your heads an Australian CEO or an Australian government minister or an Australian government departmental head or an Australian university vice-chancellor, the chances are you're probably not thinking of a Muslim Australian woman, you're not thinking of a Chinese Australian man, you may not be thinking of a Greek Australian CEO. You probably have got a different default in your head, and it's an assumption that it does affect how things play out in our workplaces. To illustrate in some more finer detail, I often get asked, by taxi drivers or others, new acquaintances, what I do for work. And I usually just tell people that I work at the Australian Human Rights Commission. Talking about race, in the first sentence, I never know where it goes, okay? But I'm struck by the number of times that people say to me, without skipping a beat, so do you work in the IT section or the finance section of the Human Rights Commission? Now, I'm told that it's because of the glasses, so if there are other... I see a few spectacled friends out there. I'm sure you get the same when you tell people what you do for work, but I suspect there are other qualities of my physical appearance that may be leading people to assume that I am a computer technician or that I'm an accountant at the Australian Human Rights Commission. The issue here is that while there is culturally diverse talent coming through, the default may be to assume that they're more likely to be technicians or they're more likely to perform back office roles than they are to be leaders or in front office roles or making deals. But of course, the cohorts from which leaders are drawn are more likely than not to be in those deal-making or client-facing or managerial positions, not the backroom technical masters. Okay, let's move on to what we prescribe in the blueprint as the steps that organisations need to take. The first is senior leadership commitment. And what I mean by that is leadership has to come from the top on this issue, and CEOs and those around them have to send a strong message that cultural diversity matters. This doesn't mean having one event every year in March where you ask people to dress up in their ethnic costumes or bring food reflecting their ancestry. I know the good intentions behind that, and it can be a start, don't get me wrong, but if you're limiting yourself in that way, then you're thinking of cultural diversity only in the lunchroom, but not in your corridors of power. I look at the gender equality experience, and the gains there have been notable, but they're still incomplete. The task is very much incomplete, but I believe that having dedicated senior leadership on gender equality is vital. Having male chief executives, for instance, talking about gender equality is vital. So it is on cultural diversity. You also need to have systems in place. And by systems, I mean two things. One, data, collecting data. Because if you don't collect the data, you won't have a sense of where your organisation is at and of the improvements that you may make over time. Again, if you look at the gender diversity experience, having the data there, having the evidence base is powerful stuff. Once you have the data, you will then be in a position to consider whether targets are worth setting. Now, there's an inevitable debate about targets, quotas, and merit. A lot of people will resist the notion of targets or quotas, thinking that this goes against the idea of appointing people based on their ability or merit. But there's one question that I think dispels any hesitation, which is, how do you define merit? And who defines merit? And I would say that the higher you get in an organisation when it comes to decision making, particularly around promotion and advancement, the more subjective your decision making may become. Questions of fit. Oh, does that person have the right fit? I'm not sure. I'm not sure they have the right fit. Maybe they're not ready yet. Maybe they're a bit aloof. I'm not sure that they've quite got the touch required. All of these code words can mask what can sometimes be assumptions about, could be gender, it could also be about culture. The final thing you need to think about is the organisational culture that you're dealing with. And here there are two things. One, dealing with bias and discrimination. I've already highlighted what I see as some of the biases that may be at play with respect to cultural diversity. The one thing I would add is that bias can be both unconscious and it can also be very conscious. There's a wide body of evidence out there that demonstrates that we have biases all the time. For example, ANU did a study in 2010 where they sent out 5,000 identical CVs. These were CVs of people who had as their place of birth Australia. So we're talking about Australian-born candidates with identical educational qualifications. The only thing that was different were the names of the candidates. So some of the candidates had Anglo-Saxon names, some had Chinese names, some had Middle Eastern, some had Italian. And the researchers found that if you had a Chinese name, you had to apply 68% more times compared to someone with an Anglo-Saxon name in order to be invited to interview. Same qualifications, just the name. If you had a Middle Eastern name, 65% more times you had to apply compared to an Anglo-Saxon name. The only place, any Melburnians here? The only place where having a non-Anglo-Saxon name was an advantage was in Melbourne, where if you had an Italian name, you were actually more likely to be invited to interview. Don't know what to make of that, but again, these are hard facts that we're dealing with here. Those are examples of unconscious biases, because I don't think there's anything conscious at all about those things. You know, other research has been done by linguists where they've put together side by side native speakers of English. The only difference being that one was Anglo-Saxon in background, the other being Asian in background, and then they asked they asked people to deliver set lectures. So again, they were delivering the same identical content, and then they asked students for feedback on the lecturers. And even though you're both talking about native speakers of English, the feedback from the students indicated that some of them had difficulty understanding the lecturer from the Asian cultural background in spite of them being a native speaker of English. Now that's not a conscious bias, but an unconscious one. But where we have conscious biases on leadership and cultural diversity is in the following forms. I've heard CEOs and chairmen of companies say, well, Tim, the reason you don't see cultural diversity being reflected in your numbers is there are just people from some backgrounds who don't want to be leaders. Now, I think that's a bold statement, but I would say if you're talking about biases that are conscious, that's a good illustration of a conscious bias, if ever there was one. The other aspect of organisational change is professional development, and this is the point on which I'll conclude. If there are pressures at play here which prevent the talented cohorts that come in at the graduate level of our companies and institutions from enjoying the trajectory you would assume they'd enjoy, I would say there are two things at play. If there's bias at play, it's pushing down on that cohort. But I would say there's also a lack of propulsion pushing up this cohort too. And if we're going to get cultural diversity right, we're going to need to have more dedicated thinking about professional development around cultural diversity, ensuring that we have talent that's identified, encouraged and nurtured, and coming out of this work, this is one of the things that I want to work on. We're going to be piloting a fellowship scheme, an executive education program with Sydney University Business School around cultural diversity and leadership. In addition, I'm setting up a leadership council on cultural diversity that will consist of CEOs and other senior leaders to advocate on cultural diversity. But that's a quick overview of some of the work that we're doing. I hope it gets you thinking as well about how your organisations can do better on diversity, because ultimately it's about us getting the most out of our organisations and our country doing as well as it should, and harnessing the talents of its people.
Well done, Tim. Okay, any questions about cultural diversity in accounting and IT? Oh, I've got one here, right. Just stand by. Sean will get you a microphone. Yep, we're good.
Thanks, Sean.
So name and where you're from?
Yeah, it's Chanel Basnaika. I'm the CEO of Northern Territory Farmers Association, so the peak industry body representing farmers in the Northern Territory. So I'm probably one of those very few in that list that you have there. I suppose my question is really, people like the amount of pressure that we feel when we are put into a place, is that, do you, when you talk, when you're out there talking to other Cs and senior people of colour and of diversity, do you see a trend in what they're experiencing, some of the common themes that they're experiencing? Because I get it a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I'll share with you some experiences I've had from CEOs who have non-European backgrounds. Recently, I was on a panel with Ming Long, who used to be CEO of Investor Office Fund, an ASX 100 listed company, and she believes that she had a double whammy issue because she was both a woman and someone from a minority cultural background. And she talks about the ways that she had to get around issues in the workplace. And she recalls, for instance, asking questions more frequently of her colleagues, because once she became CEO, she was afraid that giving instructions to her subordinates was going to alienate them and would lose her support. So she deliberately went out of her way in meetings to phrase everything in the form of questions in order to bring her subordinates along. She talks as well, she says she's an introvert. She felt that she had two lives, a work personality, and she had to work hard at being more assertive and being more extroverted, being more vocal, and then she'd go back to being her private person. There's some of the experiences that I've heard, and I would say that Ming's experiences of this have been shared by others. She's been very candid about that. But what it shows to me is that there may be some burdens which people who may come from culturally diverse backgrounds may experience, because if they fail, then it's going to make it harder for others from the same background to succeed. And this dynamic occurs as well with women. If a woman CEO fails, it may be a while before another woman gets appointed CEO.
Okay, one here, and then we'll move on to Mick.
Thanks, Tim. Bindi Turner from Nigeria, Australia. I was wondering if you think that the hard work being done in gender diversity means that cultural diversity takes a back seat. And also, the second question as well is, are there any countries that do cultural diversity in business better, and something we could use as a case study?
Yep. Well, first, there is an issue around bandwidth. This is the word that always gets thrown at me. Companies will say, we don't have enough bandwidth to do both gender and cultural diversity, so we've got to focus on gender first. But don't worry, once we get it right on gender, and it's really important because this is going to deal with 50% of the population, we can deal with culture. Now, if a CEO says that to their staff, and you are someone who comes from a culturally diverse background and you hear that, what signal do you think your CEO is sending? It's not a good signal. But also, what's the assumption of doing things sequentially in that way? Well, the implication is that you don't think you're going to succeed. Because if you believe that you're going to succeed, you don't have to wait to get it right. That to me is a confession that you believe that your work may actually fail, and that you don't have the courage of your convictions to go through with it. I would say that diversity has to be done evenly across all the dimensions, and there are lessons that are applicable from one dimension to another. Going to your second question, I would say other like countries, and we always compare ourselves with other English-speaking liberal democracies, Canada, the United States, UK. I would say that they probably don't do too much better than we do on all these measures. So we're dealing with an issue here that is bigger than just Australia. Race issues aren't unique to Australia. We are dealing here with how race and power and culture can come together. But if there is an example I would point that I believe is positive, it's Canada in the political sphere. And you may remember when Justin Trudeau became Prime Minister of Canada last year, and he appointed his cabinet, it was 50% female, and it had a very powerful representation of cultural diversity. And when asked why he did this, Justin Trudeau answered, because it's 2015.
Well done. Now we're going to move on, but thank you for that. What a privilege to have Dr. Soutphommasane here.